Hello and welcome back. This is the week 9 lecture. So now that we have finished with our analysis unit, we move on to our next type of writing, our next writing style or genre, and that will be comparing and contrasting. So we're going to spend the next few weeks doing this kind of work, and after we learn the basics of comparing and contrasting, we're going to be adding a few additional styles, a few additional writing techniques that we can later combine with our comparison techniques. So, kind of similar to what we did early in the semester when we started with narratives and then we added description a little bit later, and then we eventually wrote descriptive narrative. So for essay 3, you guys will be writing comparative analysis. You will be conducting comparisons. You will be comparing and contrasting, but we're also going to be doing a few additional things that we pick up in the weeks to come. But here in week 9, we're going to just start with comparing and contrasting, another style or writing genre that most of us are already at least somewhat familiar with. We have some experience doing this both in writing and in everyday life. So we know typically that when we are comparing two things, we are focusing primarily on similarities, shared characteristics that we can observe in those two subjects. And then when we are contrasting, that means that we are typically identifying and analyzing differences, key differences between subjects. But we can kind of put all of this work under the general header of comparative analysis. And the assumption when you are conducting comparative analysis, the assumption is that you will be looking both at similarities and differences. So we are still doing analysis. Just because we've moved on from Unit 2 does not mean that we are totally finished with analysis. It's just that we're doing a different kind of analysis now. So again, we're already pretty familiar with this. This is a pretty instinctive way of thinking, and we should think of comparing and contrasting as really a decision-making tool in many ways, because we often use it to decide between two options. If we're trying to choose between two classes that we might take in a semester, we might do a little quick comparison. We'll do a little quick comparative work to determine which class is more important, or which class will be more fun, or maybe which class will be easier, which class works better for our schedule. So we do this all the time if we're trying to choose between two or more choices, two or more options. If we're trying to choose a presidential candidate to vote for, we're going to obviously compare and contrast the two candidates. When we're deciding what to watch on Netflix or whatever, we do this kind of work then as well. We're comparing two shows, two movies. What would I rather watch? So we're familiar with this, but keep in mind that when we do this kind of work, we usually have one of two goals. We are either trying to explain the similarities and differences to our audience for some specific reason, or we are trying to evaluate the two subjects that we are comparing. So we're trying to arrive at the better option. We're trying to determine which option is better. And we might have all kinds of different criteria depending on what we're writing about and sort of what we want, what we're trying to express. But we often evaluate, we use comparison to help us evaluate. We can kind of establish strengths and weaknesses, and we can take a look at the better option. So we can either explain, or we can evaluate, or in other cases, we might do a little bit of both. But no matter what type of comparison you are conducting, you need to make sure that you're comparing two things, two subjects that are in the same general class. So for example, you could compare two movies to decide which one you want to watch, or even to explain those two movies to a person who has not seen them. You could also compare two presidential candidates to determine who you want to vote for, or again, to explain kind of where those candidates stand on the issues if you're trying to help a friend or whatever who doesn't know anything about the candidates. So I lost my train of thought there. Oh, yeah, but that's fine, but you wouldn't typically compare a movie to a presidential candidate because they're not in the same class. They're too different. So even though we are looking for differences, we need to examine two subjects that are more or less in the same class. They don't have to be the exact same, but they're the same type of thing. So comparing a movie to a presidential candidate would not really work. That's not a comparison that would work. But we can almost always compare two politicians or two movies, even if those two movies are not in the same genre necessarily. Like we could compare a horror movie to a comedy. But in some cases, the best comparison, the comparison that might yield the most results, would be to really get specific with our classes and maybe analyze two comedies. Let's compare two comedies or two horror films as opposed to kind of crossing over into different genres. It just depends on what you want to do and how specific you want to get. So in a similar way, we could compare any two politicians who are running for public office. But if we're comparing a presidential candidate to maybe a mayoral candidate, somebody running for mayor in a relatively small town, they're pretty different. I mean, yes, they're both politicians, they're both running for office, and they will probably have some commonalities, some similarities, but our comparison might work a little bit better if we stick more to the same class, the same level. So maybe two presidential candidates or two mayoral candidates, two Senate candidates. If we stay a little bit more consistent and equal in terms of our levels or kind of the hierarchy, the positions of these things, sometimes that will yield the best results. But sometimes we could compare, a senator to a governor or something. I mean, that comparison can work. It just might take a little bit more time and effort. So another thing to keep in mind, and this is a really important concept to remember, for any comparison to work, you need to have some specific points of comparison. And this is where a lot of students go wrong. This is how we get organized with our comparison. Because anybody can just kind of randomly mention similarities and differences. Like, this isn't really hard work. A lot like the narrative or even the process analysis, the actual work that we're doing, it's kind of familiar. We've done similar stuff before. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're not splitting the atom. But the key is to get organized. Just like if your process analysis is not organized, it's not going to work. You might have all the right info, but if it's not in a structure, in a sequence, in a format that can be easily followed by your audience, it's not going to work. So that's true here with comparative analysis as well. It's great to identify important similarities and differences, but if you're not doing that in an organized way, it won't really amount to much. So what you have to do is develop points of comparison that you can examine with your two subjects. Points of comparison are just like key characteristics or qualities that these subjects have. And they're the most important qualities or characteristics as far as you're concerned. So this is similar to creating your framework back when we were doing process analysis, kind of figuring out your structure. What are you going to focus on? And these points of comparison will provide the basic organization for whatever kind of comparison you're doing. So to go back to my earlier example, if I'm evaluating two presidential candidates, there's a lot of different things I could look at, but I need to identify the most important points of comparison for me. So what are the qualities in a presidential candidate that I care about the most? And this will vary, of course, from person to person. But for me, just speaking for myself, let's say I care the most about education, healthcare, and personal integrity. I'm just kind of the education one's true, but just whatever. It could be any three points of comparison, but we need to be specific and we need to write them down. And now we can examine our two candidates according to those 3 points of comparison. So now I'm going to look at where they each stand on education. Where do they each stand on healthcare? And then which one has more personal integrity based on the information that I have. And now I'm getting organized and systematic with my comparison. And now I'm ready to start putting it together, perhaps in essay form. So that's what we need to do. If you're comparing two music downloading services, you're always going to pick out the most important characteristics or qualities to look at. So maybe with the music, you're looking at selection, you're looking at price, you're looking at device compatibility. Those might be your 3 points of comparison. So let's see how our two options stack up along those lines. Let's look at those 3 points, and that's how we're going to start recording the most important similarities and differences. Because again, we can sometimes get overwhelmed with all of the different similarities and differences that we might notice. But by having points of comparison, now we have a framework, now we have a structure, we have a plan, we know exactly what we're looking for. So this will make our work a lot more focused, and it'll give us a lot more of a manageable project to tackle once we're ready to write. So once you have those points of comparison, written down in place, it's really just an observation game after that. You're just looking at your two subjects and you're writing down all of those individual elements. Again, this is a little bit like the process analysis, but now your individual elements are just going to be the individual qualities or characteristics of your two subjects within those points of comparison that you've already determined. So like I said, now with the presidential candidates, I'm writing down similarities and differences about education, healthcare, and personal integrity. I'm not all over the map writing down all of these different similarities and differences that cover all of these different areas. Now I know exactly what I'm looking for, but I need to still write down, similarities and differences using my points of comparison to guide me and keep me focused. And then once we've done that, we need to come up with why this matters. We have to decide why these similarities and differences are important. That's going to be the process of arriving at a thesis, right? What is the argument that we want to make about these two subjects? What is the larger conclusion that we are arriving at about these subjects? Again, remember our whole goal with analytical writing, we're trying to teach our audience something, we're trying to show our audience something, we're trying to enable them to even be able to do something, to complete an action, to better understand a process, whatever the case may be, and that's not changing here. That's another issue that I sometimes see with this kind of writing. Students sometimes think it's enough to just list similarities and differences. Here are all the ways that these two things are similar. Here are all the ways that these two things are different. And a lot of those observations are good, but the question is, who cares? Why does any of that really matter to anyone? So you need to remember that comparing and contrasting, those are really means to an end. they are not the end in and of themselves. So this kind of analytical work will allow us to arrive eventually at larger, sort of more important conclusions or a greater understanding of the two subjects. Sometimes if we're really sticking with evaluation, we have a clear goal in mind from the beginning. If we're evaluating two subjects, we're telling our audience which one to choose. And that can be a very clear-cut goal, and a lot of people pursue that. But that's not the only goal that we can have. We can also try to, like I said, just, kind of arrive at a larger or a greater understanding of the subjects, or to reveal certain things about the subjects that might not be commonly known to the general public. Maybe we're trying to show that these two subjects have more in common than you might think. Maybe they don't appear to be in the same class of objects or the same class of things, but in fact they do share a lot in common, and that's what you want to show us. Or you could do sort of the inverse, and you could take two subjects that would appear at first glance to have a lot in common and to be very similar, but perhaps in reality they're quite different. So you can do any number of things, but you have to have a larger purpose. You have to have an argument that you want to make. So the intentionality and our larger goals, they're not changing a whole lot from where they were with Essay 2. We're just using different subjects now, and we're conducting a different kind of analysis. But remember, we still have to answer that so what question. Why does any of this matter? Why did your process matter? You had to make that clear. Well, now you have to make clear why your comparison matters. What does it show us? What does it tell us about these subjects? And what does it enable us to do or understand as readers? So keep that in mind. And just to do a little informal practice, I posted a couple of video clips to the Week 9 module. So I would like you guys to just take a look at those when you have a chance. And I would like you to sort of practice doing the type of comparative work that I've been describing. But before I mention the movies, just one final thing to mention here in my instructional portion of the lecture. Just remember, as I put in the overview this week, you have two different organizational styles to choose from. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later when we start putting together Essay 3 in a couple of weeks. But just remember, when you're comparing, you can either go subject by subject or point by point. Either way works fine, but you need to pick one and stay consistent. So for example, in honor of Halloween, I posted a couple of horror movie clips in this week's module. So if we were going to compare those two movies, and I very much want you to, and if we were going to write that out, we would have a choice. We could go subject by subject, meaning we would cover all of our points of comparison in relation to Nosferatu, the first movie, the really old silent movie. We could cover all of our points in relation to that subject, and then move on to our next subject, which is The Conjuring, and we could cover those same points of comparison for The Conjuring, but we could keep our two subjects separate. That's one organizational style. But remember, the points of comparison will not change. So for example, if we're going to talk about, let's just say, lighting, physical spaces like hallways, that seems kind of important, and then maybe acting as our 3 points of comparison. Let's just say those are the 3 areas, those are the 3 things we want to look at in these two movies. That's how we're going to organize our comparison. So if those are our 3 points of comparison, lights, lighting, hallways, acting, we're going to talk about those 3 things in relation to both movies. But we can cover all 3 of them with Nosferatu, and then we can cover all 3 of them with The Conjuring. Our other option is to go point by point. So now we're devoting perhaps an entire body paragraph to lighting, and we're going to talk about lighting in relation to Nosferatu, and then we're going to talk about lighting perhaps in that same paragraph. We're going to talk about it also in relation to The Conjuring, and we move point by point. Then we go to hallways, and maybe we talk about both together in that section, and then we talk about the final point, and we cover both movies in that section. So just two different organizational styles to remember, and eventually you'll be picking one. So I've already given you a few sample points of comparison. Those are just the ones I picked out when I first watched these movie clips. The lighting seems very important. The spaces that we find ourselves in, kind of claustrophobic. You could think about physical space. You could think about acting. And the acting is quite different when you compare silent movies to more contemporary movies, as we can probably tell. You could also use the monsters, like the monster could be a point of comparison. You could look at the differences or similarities between the monsters in the two films. You could look at shadows, which are also kind of important. You could think about makeup. You could think about setting, sort of in general. There are a lot of different points of comparison that you could go with. And again, every individual is going to pick different ones. But as you're watching those clips, go ahead and just pick a few, just based on what you see. You can use mine if you want, or you can use any of the potential options that I just mentioned. And then, once you have those points of comparison, you can just start looking for the pertinent similarities and differences. But then try to arrive at a thesis. Try to arrive at sort of a larger point or a larger argument that you can make based on the similarities and differences that you've written down for your points of comparison. So you might want to evaluate. You might want to simply determine which of these two movies seems scarier. That could be the point of your comparison. It doesn't have to be super complicated. You just need to have an argument, a larger conclusion that you can draw. So you might just end up saying, this movie is scarier because of X, Y, and Z. You can mention some of your specific findings. Because again, you're specific now with your points of comparison. You're going to have good observations, good similarities and differences written down, and then you can arrive at what you really want to say about this comparison. So once you're done with the horror movies, you could also take a look at 3 additional clips that I posted inside the Week 9 overview. So these are not on the main page, but if you go inside Week 9, like where the overview is, scroll down right underneath this lecture link or the embedded video, you'll find some other videos. And these might be on the main page. Now I'm forgetting exactly where they are, but you guys can find them. These are 3 clips all provided in a row. And they are 3 examples of what we call tracking shots. So these all come from movies, and I find that movies work well for comparison. So these are tracking shots, which is simply a shot in a motion picture where the camera sort of follows characters around, essentially, or it sort of creates that effect. So often the camera will sort of follow along as a character walks. So this means the camera at times will be moving forward, maybe backwards, or kind of alongside the subject being filmed. And often the camera will be mounted on a dolly, so they're kind of pulling it along so it can follow the character. These are shots that tend to be pretty noticeable, even if you don't know the name. They tend to be pretty noticeable because they're often kind of impressive looking. And as audience members, we're often able to see a lot in these shots because it feels like we're moving. It feels like we're almost in the movie, moving along with the characters and seeing all the things that the character sees. So I've posted 3 famous examples of tracking shots from pretty famous movies. One is from a James Bond movie, one of the recent ones with Daniel Craig. One comes from an older movie from the 50s called A Touch of Evil. It's kind of a famous movie for film buffs, and it's largely famous because of its opening tracking shot. And then there's the famous tracking shot from Goodfellas, a pretty famous gangster movie from 1990. So that doesn't seem super old to me, but it will probably strike most of you as a rather old film. So just watch those 3 tracking shots. That's all those clips are. We're not watching the entire movies. Just look at those tracking shots and you can conduct a comparison. Again, pick out your points of comparison. What do you want to look at? What are the specific things that you want to examine within those shots? And then start listing similarities and differences according to your points of comparison. So just do a couple of practice rounds with these clips and just have some fun with them. See what you come up with. But again, don't just have your points of comparison with similarities and differences listed underneath. The final step, even for these practice activities, is to arrive at sort of that larger argument, that larger thesis. Again, try to show us something that maybe we did not notice. Try to tell us which one is better, which one is more effective. Help us arrive at a larger understanding of the subjects. Try to end up with something larger that you could potentially use as a thesis. So practice a little bit this week, get comfortable with these concepts, and then next week we'll add a few additional skills to our comparative tool belts. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.